Who were the Aztecs, the people who would become Mesoamerica's most terrifying force, started with nothing? When the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico around the early 1300s, they were homeless wanderers, a tribe without territory, without allies, without power. The valley was already dominated by established civilizations. The Toltecs had built a legacy of strength. The Tapanecs controlled vast regions. The Akalua commanded respect. The Aztecs commanded nothing. They called themselves the Mexica, and they were treated like vermin. Powerful city-states viewed them as uncivilized drifters, useful only as expendable soldiers. Some rulers hired them as mercenaries, sending them into the bloodiest battles, expecting them to die. Others allowed them to settle on unwanted land, then drove them out when they became inconvenient. The Aztecs were beaten, humiliated, and pushed to the margins of civilization. But something dangerous was growing inside this desperate tribe. Every humiliation fed their hunger for revenge. Every rejection hardened their resolve. They did not simply want to survive anymore. They wanted to dominate. They wanted their enemies to kneel. They wanted the entire valley to tremble at the mention of their name. The established powers had made a fatal mistake. They had mistreated a people who would remember every insult, every betrayal, every drop of blood. Within 2 centuries, the Aztecs would transform from despised outcasts into the most feared empire Mesoamerica had ever known, and they would make their former tormentors pay in ways that still disturb historians today. Who were the Aztecs, the people who would become Mesoamerica's most terrifying force, started with nothing? When the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico around the early 1300s, they were homeless wanderers, a tribe without territory, without allies, without power. The valley was already dominated by established civilizations. The Toltecs had built a legacy of strength. The Tapanecs controlled vast regions. The Akalua commanded respect. The Aztecs commanded nothing. They called themselves the Mexica, and they were treated like vermin. Powerful city-states viewed them as uncivilized drifters, useful only as expendable soldiers. Some rulers hired them as mercenaries, sending them into the bloodiest battles, expecting them to die. Others allowed them to settle on unwanted land, then drove them out when they became inconvenient. The Aztecs were beaten, humiliated, and pushed to the margins of civilization. But something dangerous was growing inside this desperate tribe. Every humiliation fed their hunger for revenge. Every rejection hardened their resolve. They did not simply want to survive anymore. They wanted to dominate. They wanted their enemies to kneel. They wanted the entire valley to tremble at the mention of their name. The established powers had made a fatal mistake. They had mistreated a people who would remember every insult, every betrayal, every drop of blood. Within 2 centuries, the Aztecs would transform from despised outcasts into the most feared empire Mesoamerica had ever known, and they would make their former tormentors pay in ways that still disturb historians today. The prophecy and the promised land. The Aztecs carried a prophecy that drove them forward through every hardship. They believed they had originated from a place called Aztlan, a mysterious homeland somewhere to the north. But Aztlan was their past. Their future lay in a promise given by Huitzilopochtli, their god of war and the sun. He had told them they would build a mighty civilization, a place where they would rise to power and fulfill their divine purpose. That purpose was drenched in blood. Huitzilopochtli was no gentle deity. He was a god who demanded violence, who fed on the hearts of enemies, who required constant sacrifice to maintain his strength. The Aztecs believed he fought a cosmic battle against darkness every single night. If he grew weak, the sun would not rise. Humanity would perish. The only way to keep him strong was through an endless supply of human blood. This was not mythology to the Aztecs. This was absolute truth. The sign Huitzilopochtli gave them reflected his violent nature. They were to search for an eagle perched on a cactus, tearing apart a serpent. When they found this scene, they would know their wandering was over. Around 1325, after decades of searching, they finally witnessed the sign on a small island in Lake Texcoco. Other civilizations might have seen a divine blessing of peace and prosperity. The Aztecs saw a command. Their god had shown them where to build his temple, where to spill blood in his honor, where to construct an empire that would feed his insatiable appetite for human hearts. The rise of Tenochtitlan, the island where the Aztecs found their sacred sign, was a swampy, unwanted patch of land in the middle of a lake. No other civilization had bothered to claim it. The established powers of the valley probably laughed when the Aztecs settled there, thinking these wanderers had finally accepted their place at the bottom. They could not have been more wrong. The Aztecs named their settlement Tenochtitlan, and they built it with a single vision in mind. This would not just be a city. This would be the center of the world, the place where heaven and earth connected, where the gods received their nourishment. Every stone laid, every canal dug, every structure raised served one ultimate purpose: creating the greatest sacrificial complex Mesoamerica had ever seen. They engineered chinampas, artificial floating gardens that turned the lake into productive farmland. Food became abundant. The population exploded. Tenochtitlan grew from a desperate refuge into a sprawling metropolis. Causeways stretched across the water, connecting the island to the mainland. Aqueducts carried fresh water into the city. And at the heart of it all rose the Templo Mayor, a massive pyramid where priests would carve open the chests of sacrificial victims and offer their still beating hearts to Huitzilopochtli. Within a century, Tenochtitlan had transformed into one of the largest cities on earth, home to over 200,000 people. Visitors from other regions arrived expecting a primitive settlement. Instead, they found a magnificent city built on blood and faith, a city designed to awe, a city designed to terrify, a city that would soon reach out and drag their own people to its altars. Building an empire, Tenochtitlan was thriving, but the Aztecs wanted more than a prosperous city. They wanted an empire. The problem was that they remained a relatively small power, surrounded by much larger and more established kingdoms. Taking on these rivals alone would have been suicidal. So the Aztecs made a calculated decision that would change the course of Mesoamerican history. In 1428, the Aztecs formed an alliance with two neighboring city-states, Texcoco and Tlacopan. This partnership became known as the Triple Alliance, and it created a military force that no single kingdom could resist. The three cities agreed to wage war together and divide the spoils among themselves. Tenochtitlan, with its growing population and aggressive ambitions, gradually emerged as the dominant partner in this arrangement. The Triple Alliance launched a series of military campaigns that swept across the Valley of Mexico and beyond. One by one, independent cities and kingdoms fell under their control. But the Aztecs were not interested in destroying these conquered territories. Destruction meant no future benefit. Instead, they imposed a tribute system that kept wealth flowing into Tenochtitlan without requiring permanent occupation. Conquered peoples were required to send regular payments to the Aztec capital. These tributes included everything valuable: gold, jade, cacao beans, cotton, exotic feathers, jaguar pelts, and food supplies. Some regions even had to provide human beings for sacrifice. The tribute system was efficient and brutal. It allowed the Aztecs to grow fantastically wealthy while their subjects labored to fill Tenochtitlan's storehouses. Resistance meant war, and war with the Aztecs meant devastation. Religion, the foundation of fear. To understand why the Aztecs terrified their neighbors, you must first understand their religion. It was not a quiet, private faith practiced in peaceful temples. Aztec religion was loud, public, and soaked in blood. It touched every aspect of their society, from agriculture to warfare to the very structure of their government. And at its core was a belief that made the Aztecs unlike any other civilization in the region. The Aztecs believed that the universe was fragile. The world had already been created and destroyed 4 times before. They were living in the 5th age, the 5th sun, and it too would eventually be destroyed unless the gods received constant nourishment. The gods had sacrificed themselves to create this world. Now it was humanity's duty to repay that debt. And the currency the gods demanded was human blood. This was not a metaphor or a symbolic ritual. The Aztecs genuinely believed that without regular blood offerings, the sun would stop rising, crops would fail, and the entire cosmos would collapse into darkness. Every rainstorm, every successful harvest, every sunrise was proof that the gods were satisfied. But their satisfaction was temporary. The gods were always hungry, and their hunger never ended. This belief shaped everything the Aztecs did. Their wars were not simply about territory or resources. Their temples were not just places of worship. Their entire civilization was organized around a single, terrifying purpose: keeping the gods fed so the world would not end. And they pursued this purpose with absolute, unwavering conviction. Human sacrifice. Feeding the gods, the Aztecs did not hide their sacrifices. They performed them in broad daylight, on top of towering pyramids, in full view of the entire city. Thousands of people would gather below to watch as priests dragged captives up the steep temple steps. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone watched anyway. The ritual followed a precise pattern. The victim was seized by 4 priests and forced onto a curved stone slab. A 5th priest, the executioner, raised an obsidian blade and plunged it beneath the rib cage. With practiced hands, he reached into the chest cavity and ripped out the heart while it was still beating. The heart was lifted toward the sun as an offering to Huitzilopochtli. Then the body was thrown down the temple steps, tumbling lifelessly until it landed at the bottom in a heap of blood and broken bones. This was not a rare occurrence. The Aztec calendar was filled with religious festivals, and nearly every festival demanded sacrifice. Some ceremonies required a handful of victims. Others required hundreds. During the reconsecration of the Templo Mayor in 1487, the Aztecs reportedly sacrificed thousands of captives over 4 days. Priests worked in shifts because the killing was too exhausting for any single group to handle. The scale was staggering. Skull racks, called Taze Hantley, displayed the heads of the sacrificed. Row after row of hollow eyes staring out as a warning and a boast. Visitors to Tenochtitlan could not miss them. The message was clear. this is what happens to those who oppose us, and this is what our gods require. Death and the afterlife. What made Aztec sacrifice even more disturbing was that the victims often accepted their fate. The Aztecs had constructed a belief system where being sacrificed was not a tragedy, it was an honor, a privilege, the highest possible death a person could achieve. The Aztecs believed the afterlife depended entirely on how a person died, not how they lived. Ordinary deaths led to Mictlan, a cold, dark underworld where souls wandered for eternity. But those who died on the sacrificial stone faced a different destiny. They were promised a place alongside the sun god himself, accompanying Huitzilopochtli on his daily journey across the sky. Warriors who died in battle received the same glorious fate. This belief transformed the entire psychology of sacrifice. Captives were not always dragged screaming to the altar. Some walked willingly, believing they were about to enter paradise. Aztec priests prepared victims with rituals, prayers, and sometimes intoxicating substances. The victims were told they were blessed, chosen to nourish the gods and join them in eternal glory. For the Aztecs themselves, this made perfect sense. They were not murderers. They were sending souls to heaven. They were performing a sacred service for both the gods and the sacrificed. The victim should be grateful. This twisted logic made the Aztecs even more dangerous. They felt no guilt, no hesitation, no moral conflict about what they were doing. Killing was holy work. The more hearts they offered, the more righteous they became. Neighboring tribes were not just facing an enemy who would kill them. They were facing an enemy who believed killing them was a divine act of kindness. Aztec warfare, a sacred duty war for the Aztecs, was not politics by other means. It was religion made physical. Every battle was a sacred act, every campaign a form of worship. While other civilizations fought for land, resources, or revenge, the Aztecs fought for something far more unsettling. They fought to harvest human beings. Aztec boys learned this truth from childhood. Military training began early, and it was not optional. Sons of commoners attended the Telpochcali, where they learned combat skills alongside discipline and obedience. Sons of nobles went to the Comacaac, where warfare was taught alongside priesthood and governance. Both institutions drilled the same message into young minds. A man's worth was measured by how many enemies he captured alive. Killing an opponent in battle was acceptable, but it was not the goal. The goal was to subdue enemies without ending their lives, to drag them back to Tenochtitlan, where they could serve their true purpose on the sacrificial stone. A warrior who killed when he could have captured gained little glory. A warrior who brought back living prisoners rose through the ranks, earned privileges, and moved closer to the elite warrior societies that commanded fear throughout the empire. This created a style of warfare unlike anything else in the ancient world. Aztec warriors did not simply attack, they hunted. Battlefields became hunting grounds, and enemy soldiers became prey. The Aztecs developed weapons and tactics specifically designed to wound and incapacitate rather than kill outright. Their entire military philosophy centered on one terrifying objective: taking people alive so they could die later, slowly, publicly, at the top of a blood-soaked pyramid. The warrior elite among the Aztec military. Two warrior societies stood above all others: the Eagle warriors and the Jaguar warriors. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were the empire's most lethal instruments. Men who had proven themselves in battle, by capturing multiple enemies for sacrifice. To face them was to face death itself. Admission into these elite ranks required more than bravery. A warrior had to capture at least 4 enemies in combat, a feat that demonstrated not just skill, but the cunning and physical dominance needed to subdue a fighting opponent without killing him. Those who achieved this were granted privileges that set them apart from common soldiers. They could wear cotton clothing, drink alcohol in public, dine in the royal palace, and keep concubines. But more importantly, they earned the right to wear the fearsome costumes that made them living symbols of terror. Eagle warriors, dressed in feathered suits with helmets shaped like eagle heads, their faces peering out from open beaks. Jaguar warriors wore the spotted pelts of jaguars, their heads emerging from the animal's jaws. These were not mere uniforms, they were transformations. The Aztecs believed that by wearing these costumes, warriors absorbed the spiritual essence of these predators. The eagle represented the sun and the sky, soaring above enemies with lethal precision. The jaguar represented the earth and the underworld, a nocturnal hunter that killed with savage efficiency. When enemy soldiers saw these figures advancing toward them, they were not just seeing men. They were seeing supernatural predators, warriors who had merged with the most dangerous creatures in the Aztec world. And they were coming not to kill, but to drag their prey back to Tenochtitlan alive. The Flower Wars. The Aztecs invented a form of warfare so disturbing that it had no equivalent anywhere else in the ancient world. They called it Ixayoyot, the Flower Wars. These were not spontaneous conflicts or desperate struggles for survival. They were scheduled battles, arranged in advance between the Aztecs and their neighbors, fought for one purpose alone: to capture victims for sacrifice. The concept was simple and horrifying. The Aztec Empire needed a constant supply of human offerings to keep the gods satisfied. Conquest alone could not provide enough captives, and peaceful periods meant the sacrificial altars would go hungry. So the Aztecs reached agreements with nearby states, particularly Tlaxcala and Huexotzingo, to meet on predetermined battlefields at appointed times and fight until both sides had gathered enough prisoners. These were not wars of annihilation. Nobody was trying to destroy the other side. Both armies would clash, warriors would grapple and struggle to subdue opponents, and then each side would drag their captives home. The defeated prisoners knew exactly what awaited them. There was no ransom, no prisoner exchange, no hope of release. They had been harvested, and their destination was the top of the Templo Mayor for the Aztecs. The Flower Wars served multiple purposes. They provided sacrificial victims without the expense and risk of full-scale conquest. They gave young warriors a proving ground to demonstrate their skill and earn advancement, and they kept neighboring states in a permanent condition of fear and subservience, bound to the Aztec religious system, whether they wanted to be or not. The Flower Wars turned human sacrifice from an occasional event into a sustainable industry, with scheduled deliveries of living bodies to feed an empire built on blood. Psychological warfare. The Aztecs understood something that many armies throughout history have failed to grasp. A battle can be won before the first blow is struck. Fear, properly cultivated, could shatter an enemy's will to fight. So the Aztecs made psychological warfare into a precise and deliberate science, breaking their opponents mentally long before engaging them physically. It started with reputation. Stories of Aztec brutality spread across Mesoamerica like wildfire. Tales of mass sacrifices, of hearts ripped from living chests, of skull racks stretching across temple plazas, traveled from village to village. These stories were not accidents. The Aztecs wanted their enemies to know what awaited the defeated. By the time an Aztec army appeared on the horizon, many opponents were already half broken, their minds filled with images of what capture would mean. Then came the spectacle of the Aztec approach. Warriors did not march quietly. They announced themselves with deafening noise designed to unsettle anyone within earshot. Massive drums pounded out deep, rhythmic beats that could be heard for miles, like the heartbeat of some enormous beast drawing closer. Alongside the drums came the death whistles, small clay instruments carved to resemble skulls. When blown, they produced sounds eerily similar to human screams. Hundreds of warriors, blowing these whistles, simultaneously created a chorus of shrieks that seemed to rise from the underworld itself. The visual assault matched the auditory one. Aztec warriors arrived, dressed not as soldiers but as nightmares. Eagle and jaguar warriors in their predator costumes. Others wearing grotesque skull masks or headdresses made of human bones, faces painted in terrifying patterns. To enemies watching this approach, it must have seemed less like an army and more like a supernatural force descending upon them. The weapons of terror. The Aztecs never discovered iron or steel. They had no access to the metals that armed the armies of Europe and Asia. But this technological limitation did not make them any less deadly. The Aztecs took what nature provided and transformed it into instruments of devastation that could match or exceed anything the old world had produced. Their signature weapon was the macuahuitl, a wooden club embedded with razor-sharp blades of obsidian along its edges. Obsidian is volcanic glass, and when properly worked, it can be sharpened to an edge finer than surgical steel. Spanish conquistadors, who later faced this weapon, reported seeing a macuahuitl decapitate a horse with a single swing. Against human flesh, the results were catastrophic. The obsidian blades sliced through skin, muscle, and bone with horrifying ease. Yet the weapon was designed not just to kill, but to incapacitate. A skilled warrior could use the flat of the club to stun an opponent, reserving the blade edges for disabling strikes that would leave enemies wounded but alive for capture. For ranged combat, the Aztecs employed the atlatl, a spear-throwing device that extended the warrior's arm and dramatically increased throwing power. Darts launched from an atlatl could pierce armor and kill from distances that kept the thrower safely away from close combat. This allowed Aztec forces to soften enemy lines before closing in for the capture. Aztec warriors also carried slings for hurling stones, bows for launching obsidian-tipped arrows, and tepostopili, long wooden pikes with obsidian blades designed for thrusting. Their defensive equipment included chimali shields made of wood and woven reeds, and ichkahipali, quilted cotton armor soaked in salt water that could stop arrows and deflect glancing blows while remaining light enough for the quick, aggressive movements Aztec warfare demanded. Diplomacy backed by a blade, the Aztecs did not always need to fight. Often, their reputation alone was enough to bring enemies to their knees. They developed a system of diplomacy that was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Submit willingly or be destroyed utterly. There was no middle ground. When the Aztecs set their sights on a new territory, they typically sent ambassadors before they sent warriors. These diplomats arrived bearing gifts and speaking politely, but their message carried an unmistakable threat. Join the empire as a tributary state, pay regular tribute to Tenochtitlan, and life would continue largely as before. Local rulers could keep their position. Local customs could remain intact. All that was required was acknowledgement of Aztec supremacy and a steady flow of goods, resources, and occasionally people to the imperial capital. The alternative was made explicitly clear. Refusal meant war, and war with the Aztecs meant annihilation. Not just military defeat, but the complete destruction of resistance. Leaders who defied the empire would be captured and sacrificed. Their warriors would be dragged to the temples. Their cities would be stripped of wealth, and their populations subjected to crushing tribute demands far heavier than what voluntary submission would have cost. The Aztecs made examples of those who resisted, ensuring that stories of their vengeance spread to the next target on their list. Most chose submission. The mathematics of terror made the decision simple: pay tribute and survive, or resist and watch everything burn. This system allowed the Aztec Empire to expand with remarkable efficiency. They conquered not just through military force, but through the weaponization of fear itself. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, the Aztecs controlled hundreds of tributary states spanning much of central Mexico, an empire built as much on dread as on blood. Why they were truly terrifying. The Aztecs were not terrifying because they were cruel. Cruelty existed everywhere in the ancient world. They were terrifying because they had built an entire civilization around terror and made it function with ruthless efficiency. Every element of their society reinforced the same message. Their religion demanded human blood, and they provided it without hesitation or guilt. Their warfare existed not to defeat enemies, but to harvest them. Their diplomacy offered only two options: submission or annihilation. Their capital city, with its skull racks and blood-soaked temples, stood as a permanent monument to what happened to those who opposed them. And their warriors, dressed as supernatural predators and armed with weapons designed to capture rather than kill, embodied the empire's fundamental purpose. What made the Aztecs uniquely terrifying was their conviction. They did not see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as saviors, the chosen people keeping the universe from collapse. Every heart torn from a chest was an act of devotion. Every captive dragged up the temple steps was a gift to the gods. This absolute belief removed any possibility of mercy, negotiation, or compromise. The Aztecs would never stop, because stopping meant the end of the world. When Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, even these hardened soldiers were shaken by what they witnessed. The scale of Tenochtitlan stunned them. The skull towers horrified them. They had encountered many civilizations in their conquests, but nothing had prepared them for a society that had transformed human sacrifice into the organizing principle of an empire. The Aztec Empire eventually fell, conquered by Spanish steel, European disease, and the resentment of tributary states eager to escape their grip. But the memory of what they built endures. A civilization that wielded fear as its greatest weapon, and wielded it better than anyone before or since.